Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have several developments in the north where the Ukrainians have probed in several areas within the Kursk and Belgrade regions and continued their offensive operations in the areas of active hostilities within the Kursk region. Starting out from the north, the Ukrainians have entered Titkino with a reconnaissance group. The Russians spotted this reconnaissance group and hit them with long-range strikes. This shows for the Ukrainians that the Russians are actively reconning this area, making sure that the Ukrainians do not enter, because as soon as they did, they struck their positions, forcing them to withdraw. So we see that the Ukrainians are committing to active probing attacks and recon missions within Russian territory here in the Kursk region, testing the waters, making sure that the Russians are actually aware of what is happening around them. If the Russians leave another gap in their defenses, the Ukrainians would likely expand their offensive operations. However, so far it seems that that is not happening, because 3 additional probing attacks happened to the south of the active hostilities in the Kursk region. In the direction of the village of Oserki, the Ukrainians entered into the Russian Kursk region, south of the current fighting taking place, and they launched this operation to move in the direction of Belaya to the east, where they were planning on launching offensive operations in that direction. However, in the road there, the Russians detected them and hit them with long-range strikes, forcing them to withdraw as well. Further south, in the direction of the village of Klotilovka, here in the Belgorod region, the Ukrainians also launched additional probing attacks and recon missions, as well as in the direction of Vyzimeno here in the southern parts west of Kharkiv. Based on these reports, the Ukrainians are probing across the entire front in the Sumy region, testing the waters, making sure that the Russians are present there, otherwise they would expand the front line. But exactly as I predicted, the Russians have now completely upgraded the amount of reconnaissance and defensive capabilities they have in the border areas to prevent exactly that from happening, so that they can pour all of their efforts and attention to the Ukrainian foothold in the Kursk region. And in that direction, we see 2 developments in favor of the Ukrainians. First off, in the direction of Sudzha, the Ukrainians launched a counterattack following the Russian river crossing. And the way this happened is that the Russians, being unaware that the Ukrainians had launched a attack to the north of Sudzha, flanking them from the north, were launching offensive operations within Sudzha to gain a river crossing, a foothold across the river, and enter the central parts of Sudzha. Following these developments, the Ukrainians actually flanked the Russian positions from the south, moving into Makhnovka here to the south, flanking the Russian positions. This forced the Russians to withdraw back again to the northern parts of Sudzha, where they then are now working on establishing a position to guard against further Ukrainian attacks in the village of Dmitrievkov, here east of Makhnovka, and establishing their positions along the river line west of Sudzha into the central parts and towards the northern parts as well. At the same time, there are reports of continuous fighting in the direction of Marcinovka, the general direction, to the north and to the west of it, where the Russians are clearing the areas from any Ukrainian presence to then move on to counterattack in the direction of the northern parts of Sudzha in the eastern bank of the river line. The Russians' objective right now is to regain control over the river line and properly establish defensive positions, preventing the Ukrainians from having any presence on the eastern bank before they then can move on to recapturing Sudzha. The Ukrainians are moving towards Marcinovka from 2 directions. The first direction is from Sudzha itself. With their foothold across, they can now move on towards Marcinovka. And at the same time, there are also Ukrainian presence here in the north of Marcinovka, where this geolocated footage shows Ukrainian presence within the town of Poreshno. So we see that the Ukrainians have crossed over from the western parts across the railways, which was a Russian defensive line. Through these railways, they've actually managed to cross over through the river line and forest areas and into this area here, where they, along the roads, managed to gain deep access into Russian territory. This, however, was followed with Russian bombardment of their positions, and it is reported that counterattacks are underway to regain control over these areas. As was mentioned in the previous video, the Ukrainians have general positions here in the north of Sudzha, where they've managed to infiltrate the Russian lines. However, there is no continuous assaults by the Ukrainians on the back lines of the Russian positions. There are instead units that have been there for a while, to the point that Russian sources are claiming that some of these Ukrainian soldiers are running out of fuel on their vehicles, forcing them to abandon their positions. Northwest of Sudzha, in the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian foothold in the Kursk region, we see several pieces of footage of Ukrainian convoys and vehicles being hit by Russian fire, mostly cluster munitions. We see that these convoys are moving actually in a southern direction back towards their positions, following a failed assault towards Korenevo, where the Russians still have control over the town, where they have managed to repel several Ukrainian offensive operations in that direction. We see, for example, this footage here in the forest area south of Kremyannoe, where the Ukrainians were hit by cluster munitions after being spotted in that direction. The damage on the Ukrainian convoy is unclear. But based on the constitution of these convoys, we can see that the offensive groups typically have around this number of vehicles, the 5 vehicles, fully mechanized grouping of forces. So we see that these are the types of positions that the Ukrainians are holding across the furthest parts of the front line. We see similarly in the areas where they've recently advanced, there are only a few soldiers and few vehicles on the front line, while the majority are slowly creeping forward, but they are focusing on digging in and establishing positions along the defensive lines of the Russians prior to the Ukrainian attack. So we see this line right there that I've just drawn from Derino along the river line through to the fortified positions, and again along the river lines and fortified positions all the way to the south of Sudzha. These are positions that the Ukrainians are heavily fortifying, together with the forest areas and river lines here to the east. This will allow the Ukrainians to have fortified positions that they can defend as they dig down and expect a Russian counterattack. They want to switch to the defensive, but fighting inside the Russian territory. The Ukrainian presence here in the Kursk region has now gone over the 10,000 mark, meaning that there's a lot of Ukrainian soldiers in such a small area. At the same time, the Russians are still with gaps in their defenses, as they have not completely cleared their rear, and the front line isn't the only thing brought to their attention, especially with the Ukrainian probing attacks around. Doesn't necessarily mean that the Ukrainians want to open another front. It could also simply be them distracting the Russian forces from moving to the front line and allowing the Ukrainians in the Kursk region more time to expand the territory and to dig in. Generally, there are no signs that the Ukrainian offensive is stopping. They're instead doubling down and sending additional forces into the Kursk region. There is a question as to whether or not they will open another front. So far, it's just probing attacks and nothing definitive. The Russians are continuously working on establishing a front line and from that launching counterattacks. The northwest by Korenevo is stable. There's no indication that the Ukrainians are advancing further westwards either. Instead, the main focus is here around Sudzha and the northern and southern flanks of the town, as well as the town itself, where the Ukrainians are mostly active and have made the most progress in terms of expanding since the first 3 days. Therefore, this is the main area of fighting and hostilities between the Russians and the Ukrainians. The Russians are actively working on recapturing positions here in the gray zone and pushing the Ukrainians back across the railways, after which they'll focus on pushing them back across the river line, and then the work will focus on Sudzha, after which it will be a battle towards the border area. Unless the Ukrainians gain more success and actually push beyond, then their focus will be moving on towards Martinovka and further north along the highway. The real objective of the Ukrainians beyond that, I really don't know. There is no clear indication that the Ukrainians are working on capturing a specific target. It is more likely just simply entering into Russian territory and wreaking as much havoc as possible. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.